Hey guys, welcome to this night of HSM. I'm praying that you will be blessed, that the Lord will speak to you. Here's what you can expect. We're going to be talking about finding freedom from other people's expectations and how we can live a life that is truly without restrictions, that is truly free. We're going to dive into the Bible to see what God has to say and how He made us to be free.
Attention, just to get the notice, just to get maybe more shares or likes on an Instagram video or a Facebook video or a YouTube video. Just watch just about any epic fail video, and you can tell that there's something inside of a human that changes when other people are watching. You know what I mean? I remember one time I was skiing, and I love Caleb's hat. It says, "Make skiing great again." I think it's always been great. But I was skiing at Boyd Highlands one time with some of my friends, and it was one of those big park days. I've always been like a terrain park skier, big air, flips, tricks, rails, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, so I think I was 11 years old at this time. And I remember seeing all the cool skiers go up. They've got all their cool gear. I'm still like aspiring to be a cool skier at the time. And I remember going down one time and I hit this huge jump. It was probably as tall, maybe not quite as tall as these HVAC units, but like maybe almost as tall. It's probably, I don't even know how good of a judge of feet I am. Was that 15 feet? About 15, 20 feet tall of a jump. And the first time I went over it, I landed smack in the middle of it, right? So I went, boom, and like the shockwaves went right up my legs. And it hurt so bad. And I was like, I am not going to do that again in front of all of these really cool skier dudes. And so I remember they would all sit at the top of all the jumps, and then one person would go down at a time, and everyone else up top would watch. It's kind of like the culture of a terrain park at a ski hill. And so I'm sitting there, and it's finally my turn, and I'm like, I'm not going to do that again. That was stupid. I felt so embarrassed. So I am going to get the biggest air of all of these guys. And I remember I just gunned it. I was bombing the hill going so fast. And I definitely did not hit the middle of that jump. I landed between that jump and the next jump. And I literally got on top of that 20 feet, probably another 20 feet, and overshot the jump, not by a little. I didn't just like land at the very base of the landing. I landed 10, 15 feet past the landing of the jump. And the second my skis hit, boom, everything. I mean, my skis went this way, my poles went that way, face plant. I was bleeding afterwards because I hit the ground so hard and I almost slid up the next jump. That's like how far I went. And my goggles had it's pressed to my face, went like that as I was sliding up towards that next jump. And so I got up and I was like, I think I'm done for today. And I went to the warming hut and got hot chocolate. But the truth of the matter is there's something inside of us that changes. I don't know what it is, but that changes when we get in front of other people. And we oftentimes will do crazy things just to look different in front of other people. Trying to look good in front of other people is normal, okay? That's kind of a normal thing that we experience. We all want to look good. None of us are dying or hoping to or just aspiring to do something super embarrassing just because. Unless someone paid us $100. But none of us are that's an innate desire just to go get embarrassed for the sake of embarrassment. And we all want to put our best face forward. We all want a certain level of approval in front of other people. And there's a name for that. It's called managing your image, right? So this is day and age where I don't feel like I have to explain that a whole lot. But each one of us has a certain level or a certain part of us inside that wants to manage our image, that wants to control how other people perceive us. We want to make sure the best parts of us are most visible, and the parts that we don't think are very desirable are a little bit more hidden or concealed or covered. And as crazy as that sounds, I think each one of us is like, yeah, I kind of get that. Every one of us around us is in some way managing our image. And honestly, in some ways, high school feels like that. Like the point of high school is to manage your image. It feels like maybe 5% of it is academics, 5% of it is your social life, and like 90% of high school is managing your image. That's how it feels sometimes. And you know this is true. You know this is true because it's what you're doing when maybe you tell your parent to drop you off 2 blocks before school instead of like right because you don't want to be seen next to them. Or maybe it's what you're doing when you're leaving the house in the morning with a bad hair day or a zit on your face and you just want to crawl in a hole. Like that feeling, right? You're like, I'm trying to manage my image here. It's why there's certain people that we want to hang out with, that we want to be seen around. It's why we get nervous playing a particular sport or performing in front of people. Why there's one class that we really want to be in. It's because we're all constantly working to manage our image so that we look good in front of people. It's kind of like we have one of these, like an applause meter, right? And we're going around, and inside of us, there's this internal applause meter that we're very conscious of how other people are rating us on this meter. Some people see us and they're like, boring. Like, I'm not interested in that person. And other people see us and they're like, woohoo, amazing! And most of our life is somewhere in that like not bad to sort of fantastic range, and we're trying to like get that meter tipped more towards amazing. And so we do this social game a lot of times where we're trying to manage our image, trying to manage how other people see us. Now, before we get too far into this, I do have to confess that there's a lot of messages that I try to live my life in such a way that I'm teaching from a point of like at least having experienced it at a certain level. I don't know if I'm ever an A+, but I'd like to think I sometimes am in that B+, A-, B- range on some of those aspects. If I'm being honest, what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm in process. Right? I do this. I'm speaking from experience. And if I were to grade myself, I don't know if I would go as high as a B+. And so, know that I'm not trying to talk at you. We're processing this together. But the truth is, it's not just a high school thing. It's a people thing. Right? This is something that is exhausting. Right? Like this is something that we all do to a certain extent, and at a certain level, we all feel the exhaustion or the strain of it. And no matter how well we do, no matter how many amazings we get on the applause meter from other people, we always know that there's another person that needs to be impressed. We always know that there's some other situation where our image needs to be managed. And so for a lot of us, it's not just exhausting. Like it's that, because it's never ending. But on top of the whole exhausting, the whole not looking dumb thing, it's frustrating because it hardly ever works the way we think it will. Like managing my image has an effect in my mind, but however that plays out in reality, it hardly ever works the way that we think it will. All of us have that teacher or that coach or that friend group or just that one particular friend or that parent that no matter how much we try, no matter how many things we get amazing from other people, no matter how often we succeed, no matter how proud of us we think they should be, it doesn't ever seem to be enough. And we're like, I thought I did everything right. I thought I managed an A+ image, and I'm getting a D- grade. What is going on? And when we do feel like we're looking okay, when we do feel like we're getting the applause that we're expecting, we also know it doesn't really last that long. Right? Like one day we have it, One day it's gone. One day we're playing football and we score a touchdown, and then the next week we're benched. One day we just absolutely knock it out of the park in rehearsal, and then when we get up on stage, somehow something freezes. One day we had just an amazing time with our friends or our family at lunch or at an event, and then the next day we're all in a fight. And somehow that image that we're trying to manage doesn't always last as long as we hoped that it would. And it's depressing to think about. I'm not trying to bum you guys out, but the reality is it's killing us. Why are we talking about this idea of trying to manage our image and how hard it is? Because, and here's a sneak peek of where we're going, very few things will threaten your freedom like image management. Let me say it again. Very few things in your entire life are going to threaten the freedom that you experience either on the inside or on the outside, the freedom that you actually have as a human. Very few things are going to threaten that daily, on a day-to-day basis, like image management. Like, it's the opposite of freedom, right? Freedom is the ability to act without restriction. And when we're constantly working around that need for approval in the standards that aren't even written down, but other people have kind of set in their minds for us, and almost like there's all these restrictions that we're trying to avoid breaking, man, that's the opposite of freedom. And I think sometimes our need for approval is controlling us. Our need to manage our image is making us a slave, if I could put it bluntly. So last week we talked about how Jesus wants us to be free people. We looked at Galatians 5:1. For freedom, Christ has set you free. But what do we do if the fight for approval takes up our lives and keeps us from feeling freedom? It makes us feel everything but free. We started jumping into the book of Galatians. If you have your Bible, I highly recommend turn to Galatians chapter 1. And it was this letter that Paul wrote to a bunch of followers of Jesus in this area called Galatia. And they had heard the message of Jesus, and Paul had led them in discipleship, and he had started a church there, and he started to preach the truth about Jesus to them and share with them the message, the good news of Jesus. And then he left, and that's why he's writing the letter. But apparently, between those two times, the teachers that began to rise up in the church in their area began teaching something that was totally different. And it was something that began to threaten their freedom. Because Paul's initial message to them was, Jesus saved you, you're free from sin, Jesus made this relationship between you and God restored again. You have a right relationship with God because of what Jesus did. And then these other guys come around and they go, well, not so fast. Like, actually, you still have to do all of these laws and perform all of these restrictions, stay within all these restrictions that were in the Old Testament for God's people, Israel. And since you're now becoming part of God's people, you have to do everything we've always ever had to do. And then once you've done all of those things, then your relationship with God can be right again. And this made Paul really, really mad. Right? Like, he was ticked off. Oftentimes I'll play games with my daughter Grace. She's 2, almost 2. She's turning 2 on Thursday. And she really likes playing with blocks with me, but for totally different reasons. She likes doing puzzles with me, but for totally different reasons. And it frustrates me, because I like putting the puzzle together. I like building something with the blocks. You know what her favorite thing is? Tearing it all down and creating chaos all over again. I'm like, no! The OCD part of me is dying on the inside. Like, she loves tearing it apart again. And it's just that thing that I worked so hard to build, just to see it destroyed. In that way, but like much more so, Paul worked very hard to build this church and to invest his life into these people and to teach them and to pray over them and to shepherd them. And then all of a sudden he is super upset because these teachers are coming in and teaching what Paul says is a totally different gospel. To sum it up, basically, you have to earn your relationship with God by keeping all the rules. And if you don't, well, maybe you don't belong here. And Paul's like, that's not the gospel. That's not what I'm talking about at all. And so Paul opens his letter like this. Galatians chapter 1, starting in verses 6 and 7. I am astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ, and you're turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion, and they're trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. And those are like super direct words. He's getting straight. I mean, he doesn't even start off with a whole lot of pretense. Like, he just gets straight into it. Then a few verses later, he says in verse 10, because let me read up to that point, because he's pretty strong. Okay, he doesn't really care what people are thinking at this point. This is what he says: even if we or an angel from heaven preach the gospel other than the one we preach to you, let him be eternally condemned. I think it's appropriate for me to say, damn! I guess we've said already, so now I say again. Like, that's what he's saying. Like, let that person experience eternal damnation if they preach a different gospel. As we've said already, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. And you're like, Paul, nice to see you too. Wow. But I love what he says next, because he continues on, verse 10. Am I now trying to win the approval of men, of people, or of God? Or New Living says it this way: I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I wouldn't be Christ's servant. He's basically saying, I'm probably going to make you mad here with what I say, but I want to set the record straight. Like, I'm not here for your approval. I'd like you to think nice of me, but to me, that's not the point. Which, it's not like Paul needs any more enemies. People around the world are already trying to kill him, right? He has to run from town to town at certain times to avoid getting persecuted, avoid imprisonment, avoid getting killed, which eventually happens. And so if anybody to think of as like being on the other team, if anyone to think of as being opposed to him, you wouldn't think he'd go looking for a fight within the church that he planted. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's not like he doesn't have any enemies. You would have thought that they were on the same team, but Paul knew that they had heard something different from what following Jesus actually meant. And I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert. What Paul says is true for us. We need to really take notice here. Paul knew that they had heard something different about what following Jesus actually meant. And he was not okay. In fact, he knew he was going to rock the boat, potentially risking his relationship with them. But he also knew that the message of Jesus was on the line. A message that says that freedom from sin, without the burden of people having to earn their relationship with God through their behavior, that message was on the line. So Paul had a decision. Does he care more about what these people think about him? Or does he care a little bit more about what God thinks about him? It's basically this decision between the approval of other people or the approval of God. And I think that's a tension we both feel. Maybe we feel it, maybe we don't, but we are living in that tension, guys. Paul spoke these words at the very beginning of the letter because he wanted to set the stage for the rest of the letter. Check out again, just to stay back on verse 10 here. I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul's a little bit more concerned with what God thought. And maybe for you, you're like, oh boy, that sounds kind of harsh. I thought you were talking about grace. He says in verse 3, grace and peace to you. Now he's like, those teachers should go to hell. And you're like, Paul, what is it? What are you talking about? This is kind of confusing. What's going on? I don't think Paul's being a jerk here, okay? Because going after the approval of God doesn't mean that you have a permission to act in such a way that no one likes you. I don't think that wins God's approval either. Right? Like, that's not what Paul's trying to do. Going after the approval of God does not necessarily mean losing the respect of other people. In fact, in the very next verses, Paul addresses the church in Galatia as brothers and as sisters. He obviously cares about a relationship with them. But he knew that to only care about a relationship with them on a superficial level actually was not to care about them at all. That if he truly cared about them, there was something deeper going on that he wanted to see different. They needed the truth. They needed the gospel. And so he told them, even at risk of what it would do to their relationship. And he's basically saying, guys, there is a difference, a big difference about caring about something and being controlled by it. Like, he cared about the people who made up that church. He cared about the influence that he had in their lives. He cared about the influence he had with them, but he was not controlled by his need for their approval. If you could read between the lines of what actually is happening in this relationship between Paul and the people of this church. Obviously, he cares about them. He's not trying to be a jerk, but he doesn't need their approval. And that's an important distinction to make, because the small difference is what kept him being controlled by whether or not they approved of him. He wasn't controlled by that. And praise the Lord, because now we have a clarity in the gospel, a clarity in the freedom that Christ offers, because Paul was not necessarily concerned about his need for approval from other people. He knew that free people live for God, and not necessarily for the approval of others. Or to put it simpler, free people live for him, not them. Free people live for him, not them. People who truly have a release from the control of other people's opinions. People that truly have a release from the control of anxiety. People that truly have a release from having to fit into certain boxes that other people kind of put you in. Free people that man, you guys know free people. You know people who are like, man, I just am so excited about life. I got so much joy. I don't care what other people think, because I know what God thinks. Free people live for him, not them. But it's not so easy to do, is it? Right? Like, that's great in theory. But it's not always easy to care what other people think, but not be controlled by their opinions. So how do we know if we're being controlled by the approval of others? How can we see that happening in our lives? I want to give you 4 ways that we can know, or at least maybe a few indicators. Number 1, if you're willing to do things when people are around that you wouldn't do alone, you might be controlled by the approval of others. Number 2, if what other people say to you or think about you, whether it's a coach or a teacher or a group of friends, if what other people say to you or think about you changes how you think of you, how you feel about yourself, you might be controlled by the need for approval. If you feel like, number 3, if you feel like you're living different lives depending upon what group you're hanging out with, right? Being one way with a group of friends, being another way at home, being another way at church, being another way with a different group of friends, you might be controlled by the approval of others. for if there's a church version of you, a school version of you, and a home version of you, you might be controlled by the approval of others. And here's why that matters, guys. You weren't made to be controlled by anything. Paul says later on, God made you for freedom. That's why he set you free. Remember, Jesus wants us to be free people. That's what we talked about last week. And free people don't live with every action being controlled by how other people think about them. Now, let me just make a distinction. Here's not what Paul is saying. In seeking the approval of God, it doesn't matter what other people think about me, therefore it doesn't matter how I treat them. He's not saying that. Okay? It's not what he meant. I think it's important for us, for those of us who are Christians, to treat other people very, very well, whether they deserve it or not, because of how God has already treated us, even though we didn't deserve it. Right? And I don't think that gives us a free pass to be jerks. I don't think it gives us a free pass to be people who are the reason someone else doesn't follow Jesus. If I get to the end of my life and I realize that I had been the reason somebody else didn't follow Jesus because of how I treated them, I will consider that, at least in that part, to have been a failure. That's not what we're called to be. That being said, I don't have to be controlled by a need for their approval. Now, before we wrap up, I want to get personal for a second, because there's chances are there are at least one or two relationships in your life, I know there are in mine, where you care way more about your image, way more about their approval than you should. A relationship where, if you were being honest, they actually kind of have control over you, or over your emotions, or over your view of yourself, more than you'd like to admit it. That you're like, there's certain things I would not do around those people, or that person. I know, like I said, I'm in process, so that's true for me. It's probably true for all of us. Chances are, they don't even mean to have that influence on you. In fact, they probably don't even know, but you care so much about what they think. And maybe people have noticed that about you. Maybe someone has said something to you about, man, you act kind of different around this person. Or, wow, like, what got into you? But you don't know what to do about it. Like, what do I do? Like, yeah, okay, I get it. I love what he says later towards the end of the book of Galatians, chapter 6. Turn with me to Galatians 6, chapter 6, verse 4. He says two verses that are pretty powerful, pretty impactful. Galatians 6, 4 and 5 says, pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. In other words, you worry about you. You're responsible for yourself. You don't want to be a background dancer in the performance that is your life. Right? You don't want to be a background musician in the soundtrack that is your life. You don't want to be a background player or a bench player in the ball game that is your life. You don't have to let somebody else's opinions about you decide your own behavior. Your responsibility for you lies with you. I mean, it's almost kind of like Paul was saying, man, you do you. You do you. Not because he didn't care what other people thought, but he understood that something that I think we sometimes miss. And I'm about to say, and I really hope you listen, because you don't need others to give you what you already have. You don't need for somebody else to give you the approval that you have already been given by God. You don't need somebody else to give you what you already have. You don't need their approval because God already approves of you. He's crazy about you, and free people live with this in mind. Free people are not controlled by the approval of other people because they know they've already got an eternal version of it that's in their possession. They don't have to worry about what somebody else thinks. They don't have to try to control all of their actions or their behavior or their outfits or their language because of somebody else's approval that they're trying to gain. Because they know, man, I've got an eternal version of that, and it's so much better than what anybody else can offer me. I'm not controlled by them anymore. I'm free. And free people get that. They rest in what God has done for them, and they don't worry about trying to live up to any other standard. I hadn't planned to say this, but I think this is so important. When I start talking about the fact that you no longer have to live up to a standard that somebody else sets for you, that your behavior cannot get you any closer to God, and somebody else's behavior cannot increase the distance between them and God, that you've been given freedom, that everything you will ever do and ever have done has already been paid for. Some people in the church get all uptight about that because they're like, oh no, you're opening the floodgates. Now all of a sudden people are going to start doing whatever they want because they know they've been forgiven. Which is exactly what Paul is writing about. That's what people were doing. They were coming in the church and they were saying, no. Unless you live up to this particular religious standard, you don't belong. And Paul's saying, you go to hell. He literally says that. I'm not putting words in his mouth. And so what I think is so important to realize is, man, you've been given freedom. You don't have to earn God's approval. You already have it. We live out of that, not for it. And that is the gospel, this side of the cross. That it's been done for you. You don't have to do anything to get it or to increase it in your life. And don't let somebody else give you another gospel. Free people live for Him, not them. And I think if that truth sank this deep into you, from your head to your heart, it would set you free. There are things, though, that get in the way. And I think those things are our fear of approval. I think we don't let ourselves be free. I think we still avoid freedom because to us, we might lose the approval of somebody else. And guys, I want you to know you already have it. You already have it. You have the approval of a Father who sees you as righteous, who sees you as completely, perfectly, spotlessly blameless. You have Christ's record. So there is no more amount of proud that God can be of you. Your Father is proud of you. You are free. You don't have to live up to somebody else's standards. Free people live for Him because they know they already have His approval. We're going to head to small groups in a moment, but I want you to imagine how different your life would be if you didn't feel the pressure to manage your image all the time. It's exhausting, guys. I know, because I feel it too. Imagine what your life would be if you didn't feel the pressure all the time to get the approval of other people? What would it look like if you started to live as though you actually believe that what God has done for you is enough and that no one can take away or add to that? How much time would you get back? How much stress? How much fatigue? Man, how much fakeness would you get back if you really believed that you already have approval? I think that's something that free people understand. That Jesus made you for freedom. Free people live for Him, not for them. Let's pray. Jesus, convince us of your freedom. Jesus, show us the freedom that we're missing out on. Jesus, give us a greater vision of you and of the freedom that you have for us, that you've made us for. I pray that we would not live for the approval of others, but that we would bask in the sunlight of your eternal approval that was made possible by Jesus. God, I pray that we would not be on the do system where we have to constantly do things, but that we would be on the done system, that we would rest in what's already done for us. God, I pray that we would actually have